Welcome to all of you. I'll be talking briefly about poetry today, which is, of course, a subject of vast scope because it can mean world poetry today or Indian poetry today or the poetry of my language today. But obviously, I will have to confine myself to a few significant points regarding the importance of poetry today and its role in the larger resistance to various kinds of oppressive systems, the various kinds of authoritarianism that we encounter every day, and indeed the plight of mankind as we confront it today, especially in the time of a pandemic that is gradually growing and creating an atmosphere of fear, which again has become an instrument of oppression or empowered oppressors further. If you just look at the behavior of a Trump or a Bolsonaro or an Erdogan or quite a few other leaders more familiar to us, you will find that even this disease has in some sense empowered them, made their autocracy even more powerful, and they have been able to bring a kind of emergency in their countries in the name of this pandemic. But at the same time, one thing that we need to see is that the poets write their best poems during times of pain, of grief, of anguish. It was James Joyce, the great novelist, who said about writers, "Excuse us, we are olives," which means the world gets the best out of writers in the worst times, when they are excused, when they are under great pressure. And it is in this sense that once Adorno, the great Frankfurt thinker, said poetry is impossible after Auschwitz, by which probably he meant that not that poetry is impossible after something like Auschwitz, after the Nazi concentration camps, but the old kind of poetry that Nightingales and Bulbuls, enough. Perhaps we need to create a new kind of poetry that can address the larger issues of our time, where of course nature and environment will also play a part. So, and it is this new kind of poetry that the great post-war Polish poet Tadeusz Rosewicz defined in his own way. He said the new kind of poetry is a poetry for the horror-stricken, for those abandoned to butchery, for survivors created out of a remnant of words, salvaged words, out of uninteresting words from the great rubbish dump. And that is exactly what has happened. Because even after Buchenwald and Auschwitz and all those terrible, terrible concentration camps, poetry lived and survived. We had great poets like Paul Celan, then Lisa, Abba Kovner, who are generally called the poets of the Holocaust, coming from Germany itself, even though some poets did run away from Germany because they felt the marrow of their language has been filled with lies and they cannot speak truth in the language used by Hitler or Himmler or all the notorious propagandists of Hitler. But yes, poetry survived. A new kind of poetry was created out of the poison gas of the concentration camps. A new poetry that would speak about human beings, that would make them friends, that would not alienate them, that would tell them about their own torn selves, their own anguish and pain and dilemma and the kind of everyday issues that they encounter in their ordinary lives. So we are in fact passing through a similar time. I would not compare it perhaps to the Nazi time or the fascist time of Mussolini, but if you look around the world, you will see that there is growing authoritarianism across the world. So I have already named a few, and you can add more names like Viktor Orban and quite a few other people, maybe Putin, maybe even the governments of China and the Soviet Union, which at one time had risen as one man against oppressive systems, especially the oppressive feudal system or the capitalist system. But you find that most of these countries have in some sense been taken over by some kind of tyranny, one kind of authoritarianism, and there are othering practices happening. There are anti-immigrant laws being passed. There are, the old environmental restrictions are being removed. Labor laws are being diluted. And so behind the masks of that we wear and behind the isolation that we now experience, you find a lot of new economic and social controls happening and a lot of surveillance. The media have become a major source of surveillance, like Foucault speaking of panopticon, where he is speaking about the structure of the old jails about which Bentham had spoken, where in the center of the jail there would be a tower and there would be a watchman there who could see all the prisoners in their rooms. But even if the watchman is not there, the prisoners would imagine that the watchman is there and they would be afraid and they would behave. So now there is no need of such a panopticon, there is no need of a tower, there is no need even of a jail. With the new social media, with the new kinds of applications, you can make the whole world a prison. So why do you need a new prison? If you can be observed through your Facebook activity, your Twitter activity, and your various kinds of social media, perhaps there is no need of a jail at all, and there is no need of declaring an emergency. You can have a state of emergency, and you can be always under observation. Everything that you do, every place that you move to, every location that you are in, every word that you utter in public places. Or even privately, everything is being heard, everything is being seen, and so we are living, in fact, in a time of almost absolute surveillance from which nobody seems to have any kind of escape, and that surveillance is on the increase. So there is a new kind of, cyber surveillance, cyber authoritarianism that is creeping into our lives, and that has made our lives even more difficult. So so I would not speak at length about that, because that is another topic altogether in some sense, but I want to connect it with poetry. So what is the role of poetry today? I would say that the role of poetry, in simple terms, is to speak against violence, to speak truth to power. And this violence today comes from many sources. One is certainly globalization, which is a kind of one-way conversation where you cannot speak back. There is a kind of command from above, and it is not like internationalism where every country is supposed to be sovereign, but it is an empire, thrusting its views on every nation, telling everyone how you should develop, what kind of loan you should obtain, what kind of prices you should fix for the things that you sell other people or even to your own people, what kind of authority you should use views over your people. So globalization is a kind of one-way communication. It is generally an exercise of power by what the thinkers Hart and Negri call the empire. It is a new empire which is founded on surveillance and on neoliberal economy. So it suppresses languages, it suppresses cultures, it makes it makes the whole world monolithic, and diversity is the first victim of globalization, as it is of all kinds of monolithic views of society, whether it is a Hindutva view, or whether it is an American white view, or whether it is a male view. Where in all these monolithic views, what is lost is ultimately the diversity of viewpoints, the diversity of culture. So globalization is one thing that we need to resist through every form of art, including poetry. By asserting our local identities, by asserting our regional linguistic identities, we need to fight any kind of homogenization. And secondly, there is patriarchy. And India is perhaps the worst example of a patriarchy, which is still very much alive and very much oppressive, felt at home and felt in the larger society, because women are continually oppressed, whether they are in public places, whether they are in high offices, or whether they are in low offices, or even whether they are in the kitchen. Everywhere there is oppression of women, and so patriarchy is a second form of violence that we face. And then there is, of course, communalism, especially in a country like India. It also happens outside. In a country like India, for example, what goes by the name of Hindutva is nothing but a form of religion completely devoid of any spiritual content. It is religion that is politicized. It is a religion which is twisted and turned out of shape, because it silences all the argumentative traditions that we had. All of you have read Amartya Sen's famous book, Argumentative Indian. So India definitely has a tradition of argument, a tradition of different kinds of philosophical systems, different ideas, different worldviews, and they were always either in conversation or in conflict. Yes, sometimes conflict was there too. But then we had, and our culture is not created by a single race or a single religion. Remember that always, because, and according to the latest investigations, you find that the first people of India had come from the African continent, and then there were several waves of migrations through which there were people from the Mediterranean who came to be later called Dravidians, even though these words are suspect. And later there was a movement from Central Asia somewhere around 18th century BC, and those people are called Aryans, a word which is very much contested by historians like Romila Thapar. But some people came from Central Asia at that point of time. So there have been many migrants, and then the colonialists came from the Dutch colonialists, the Portuguese ones, and finally the British. So there were several waves of migration, and then many religions came to India. Originally we had the tribal religions, and then many other religions came, and there was no religion called Hinduism. In fact, there were many kinds of cults. There were Tantrics, there were Shaivites, there were Shaktayas, there were Vaishnavites. So, and all these, now the Hindutva people claim that there is a religion called Hindu religion, but that, as we very well know, is a very recent construct. We had only many different cults and methods of worship, including the worship of mother goddesses. Well, that is another story into which again I am not going, how these mother goddesses became, Kali or Durga or Saraswati or Lakshmi and all that, and how black goddesses suddenly became white, and how the monkey gods of tribals became Hanuman. So there are a lot of researchers, right from D.D. Kosambi onwards. Historians have worked a lot on this kind of the creation of a monolithic religion. And so the majority communalism has become extremely oppressive, and the minority is feeling alienated. They feel they don't belong here because they are being continually tortured, continually othered, and now there are plans to deny a lot of them Indian citizenship. And so we need to care for the minority and stand with the minorities to listen to their voices and become their voice too through our art and through our poetry. And then there is nationalism, which Tagore condemned, without any kind of doubt. What he meant was a kind of jingoistic nationalism, where nation becomes an idol of worship. He was not against patriotism, nor am I against patriotism. It is something natural. We all love our country. But nationalism is an ideology where we begin to say that our nation is the greatest nation, and the greatest people are our people, and all others are inferior to us. We want to create civilization and culture and poetry and everything. So that kind of vanity and the egoism that goes with it, and the hatred that it creates, and that hatred also sometimes appears as a racial hatred, and that is where this very narrow, insular, exclusive, jingoistic kind of nationalism becomes a major enemy of the country. It finally leads to a division of the country. We already have suffered from one partition, or perhaps two partitions, and now there is an attempt at another partition by alienating the minorities. So communalism is another major source of violence, even physical violence, that I did not give you example. We see that every day, and even now we see that how our migrant workers are being treated. And then along with that goes casteism, as in India, the Savarna ideology, which oppresses the Dalits and the people of the so-called lower caste. And casteism is certainly a major source. It has always been a major source of violence in India. And then there are anti-labor, anti-immigrant attitudes. There is what can be called eco-fascism, which is the complete destruction of environment for the profit of a few, not for the people, but just so that a few people can become rich, or a few corporates can become rich. Environment is being completely destroyed, and ecological rules are being twisted or diluted every day, and that has been happening even during these days of the COVID pandemic. And and there is a continuous mechanization of human beings happening. There is a lot of talk about, like Harari speaks about cyborgs and the gradual disappearance of human values and human attitudes. So there are various kinds of threats in front of us, and no poet, no artist can speak anything meaningful completely evading these different kinds of threats of oppression, or what I call violence. So we need to resist this violence. I don't know. I am not saying that directly we should write about everything that is happening around us. It could be indirect. It could be oblique. It could be a celebration of nature, where naturally you bring in an ecological consciousness. And you could be speaking about the importance of privacy, the importance of individual in a society which is turning into a mass society. And so one has to definitely say, along with say Czesław Miłosz, the great Polish poet, who said, in a room where people maintain a conspiracy of silence, one word of truth sounds like a pistol shot. You who have wronged a simple man bursting into laughter at his suffering do not feel safe. The poet remembers. Deeds and talks will be recorded. So that is one of the functions of poetry. Poetry as witness. Poetry that records deeds and words. Poetry that celebrates freedom, that celebrates human life, that celebrates nature, that celebrates sexual difference, that celebrates persecuted identities. So, and that is why in India, perhaps now, the most radical poetry is written by women by LGBT people or those who favor LGBT movement, by the oppressed Dalits, by Adivasis or the tribal people, by minorities, by people who are very much concerned with ecology and environmental catastrophes like global warming and many other things that are keeping happening around us, of which even the coronavirus could well be a product. So what I want to say is that there has always been a counter tradition in our poetry from the very beginning. You had poets like Yogeshwara in Sanskrit. We speak of Kalidasa, we speak of Bhasa, but we had also poets who spoke about the ordinary peasant's pain like Yogeshwara, and we had the epics. And it is wrong to imagine that the epics were all about battles. Even Mahabharata is actually an epic against war, because it ends in the consciousness of the absurdity of war. And it doesn't take sides. It is the people who interpret it that takes sides, but it doesn't take sides. So because if you actually read through Mahabharata, you can find how, in the name of dharma, so much of adharma was done. And dharma was always a dubious kind of question throughout the Mahabharata, if you read it. So you can read Mahabharata from the point of view of Ekalavya. You can read Ramayana from the point of view of abandoned Sita. So the epics can also be part of the counter tradition if we read it properly from the point of view of the minor characters or the women characters or the persecuted characters in those epics. And then we had Bhakti and Sufi poetry, where priesthood was questioned, the supremacy of a single religion was questioned, where the hegemony of Sanskrit was in question, and where a new kind of spirituality, a people's spirituality, came up, and it was placed against the authority of priesthood. And if you believe in God, well, you can talk directly to God. You don't need a priest. That's what Kabir would say. So why should you go to a church or a mosque or a temple? You say God is everywhere. Then why should you go to a particular place to worship God? Kabir repeatedly says this, and he denies the authority of all the mullahs and all the pujaris and all priests of all kinds of religion. And this happens with Tukaram, with Basava, with Bulle Shah, with Baba Farid. It happens with Akka Mahadevi, with Lal Ded, with Mirabai, a lot of women saint poets, Bahina Bai, Narsi Mehta, and one could go on naming them. So they were all opposed to the hegemonic idea of religion and tried to create a people's idea of religion, which was an egalitarian community. They dreamt of an egalitarian community and tried to create a new kind of equal community. Sometimes they actually created models like Basava did. The Basava in Karnataka created an actual community where everybody was equal. There was no difference between the Dalit and the Brahmin, no difference between the man and the woman. And so we have this tradition. And certainly Buddha and Mahavira also belong to this tradition of questioning, of interrogation, of opposition. So we need to reread our tradition against the kind of reading that is always presented to us by the hegemonic people, who speak, who say that they represent Hindutva, which they really don't. If we believe in these argumentative tradition, in the various kinds of worldviews that existed once in India. So we need to reread our tradition, reinterpret our tradition, and accept those positive things in our tradition which are of relevance and importance to us, and reject everything that is harmful, including the caste system. That is why Ambedkar spoke of the annihilation of caste. So reject everything that is negative and accept everything that is positive in our tradition. Because if you give up everything in our tradition, finally it will be completely appropriated by the enemy, by those who want to misuse our tradition. So we need to be conscious of our tradition, but conscious of whatever is good, whatever is positive. I'm also supposed to be reading some poems. I don't think I have much time for that. But then, yes. So what I want to say is that today's poet has to create a kind of synthesis of tradition and modernity, and he or she has to realize that there is no contradiction, as it is often made out, between the local and the universal, between the contemporary and the eternal, between the suggestive and the narrative, between the individual and the social, and between one style and another style, between the so-called pure poetry and the so-called impure poetry, which is the term used by Pablo Neruda to describe his kind of poetry. There is no contradiction between the magical poetry and revolutionary poetry, no contradiction between realistic poetry and imaginary poetry, because actually poetry is able to contain all these kinds of contradictions. It can be contemporary at the same time, because Ramayana was speaking about contemporary things, Mahabharata spoke about contemporary things, and even the speakers were characters in those epics, and still we call them epics. So being contemporary does not mean that you are not going to survive. So this is one of the wrong notions we have about poetry. So similarly, often styles, even the same poet may use different styles depending on the theme that he or she has to handle. So it is not right to say the man is the style. First of all, they say the style is the man. No, the style is also the woman, first of all. But secondly, if you look at poets very closely, you will find they have used different kinds of styles in different kinds of poems, depending on the context and the mood and the theme that they handle. And so the revolutionary poetry can also be magical. If you have read Lorca, if you have read Pablo Neruda, if you have read even Faiz Ahmad Faiz, or any of the radical poets of our time, or Tagore, or Nasrul Islam, you will find there is an element of magic, there is an element of mystery, but there is an element of social radicalism in their poetry. So poetry absorbs everything and dissolves all these contradictions in a single organic unity, and that is where poetry becomes different from many other forms of literature and many other forms of art. So to our young poet, I will end with this single sentence. Nicanor Parra, the great Chilean poet, told the young poets, he has a short poem called Two Young Poets, where he said, "Write in any way you like. No way is sacrosanct anymore. So much blood has flowed under the bridge. Only you must advance on the blank page." This is what, as a poet who has been writing for, almost half a century, this is what I have to tell my younger poets: advance on the blank page. Find your location, find your place, find your voice, and try to create something new out of the blank page, because so many pages are already filled. So you have to discover the page which is still unwritten, the voice which is still not raised, or which has been silenced, and then try to find your own space in the great world of poetry. So we need to get, of course, I'm also looking at the questions which are coming about the misinterpretation of religion and pseudo-secularism and orthodox religion. There's a question as to how we find a right approach. Well, I would just say, look at Gandhi, look at Kabir, look at Tagore. They did not deny religion. They were religious in their own way, but they stood for the amity, the unity of all religions. Even Sri Ramakrishna said he lived in all religions and came out and said, I did not find any difference between Allah and Jehovah, and Rama or Krishna. So I found the same God everywhere. And so this is our tradition. But you can be a non-believer. So because we have had, right from Charvaka, we have had also non-believers. Right from Ajita Kesha Kampli, we have had people who questioned existing hegemonic ideas. So you can question. So there is a place for all kinds of thinking in our society. But in a society where the majority of people are religious in some way, Whatever be the religion, I myself am not a religious person, but I would certainly advocate that, well, we should be able to speak about a unity of religions. That's what the Sufis did. That is what the Bhakti poets did. And that is what Gandhi also was trying to do. And that even in his prayer meetings, as you know, he had prayers from every religion. And maybe that is one good example of how we can approach religion and belief without denying the authenticity of religion. That you can do. As a rationalist, you can do that. But then, if you want to carry people along with you, perhaps you need to speak about the ultimate unity of all religions and of a spirituality which is above all kinds of narrow considerations and insular attitudes to religion and to the world. Now what I will do is, I don't know whether I have time. I don't know what Richard and all of you think. Maybe I'll read a poem or two, and maybe I'll come back later to read more poems in your group. I'll read one or two very recent poems. Let me begin with a poem called, of course, some of the poems you had put on your website, which means you have read them, at least parts of the poem, so I'm not reading them. I'll read one or two new ones. One is called Women. Of course, I write in Malayalam. These are my own translations into English. Women. One woman walks in a hurry, sobbing, a house with faded paint on her head. One woman walks in a hurry, sobbing, a house with faded paint on her head. One woman goes on waiting at a railway station where no train stops. One woman with a halo of glowworms walks in the dark towards the stars. One woman makes sure her wings are in place before she launches herself into a flight. One woman steps into a cornfield in drought with a rain cloud on her shoulder. One woman sings a song making a fruit tree in autumn burst into blossoms. One woman glints like a spark of fire in the ashes of her little house set on fire. One woman scoops up her baby and flees to the border, watching a fighter jet swoop down. One woman sharpens the letters of the alphabet and pulls out the fangs of the enveloping dark. One woman closes the door of her house with a bang, walks out and hums a medley on the street. One woman looks at the image of Jesus on the cross and yells in agony, "Son, my darling son." One woman leaves her man on the panel in Khajuraho and finds her pleasure herself. One woman, her muscles hardening as I look on, turns into a goddess of iron and fire. One woman sharpens her sickle again and again, rubbing it against a rock in a forest stream. One woman climbs up a tank and offers flowers to soldiers with the moon's smile. One woman, tired of her life on earth, leaves for space in a vehicle made of her own bones. One man stands aghast on the roadside, too scared to cross the road. That is the poem called Woman. I'll just read one more, a short poem which I wrote 3 days back, and I hope I'll end it here, and later maybe I'll come back for a reading. It's called, if you want me I can go on, but otherwise I'll stop. A small spring. A small spring that a casket can contain, or the pupil of an eye. So intense were its colors and odors, it couldn't have lasted long, like some adolescent loves. A small spring, like a flame of the forest, in full bloom, unaware of the arrival of winter. Why did it vanish so fast? I asked the wind. A drizzle was the reply. It had some floating petals that God had kept as bookmarks in life's account book. I could not decipher the script as they were dried up, wrinkled. A small spring, more scorching than summer, burning with pleasure. I stopped kissing anyone except solitude in its tight black gown. I opened the windows wide. Suppose it comes back like the spilt wine returning to the cup, shouting with passion, "Come and lift me up." A small spring, a pang, my lips quiver with desire. Cheers. Shall I stop it here? Okay, if you want. Yeah, Priyanka says she wants to listen to more poems. I'll read one or two more. Thank you. Well, another recent one, a very, very short one called The Keys. When Gandhi was shot dead, I was just 2. Father must have wept. I don't remember. When Nehru died, I was 18. Father came home with a newspaper, and I saw him sit down, almost fall, his hands on his brow, leaning forward, pale. When father went on his pilgrimage, he had left his bunch of keys at home. He never returned. Only the news came on the 3rd day. Even today, I keep on trying those keys to open the secrets of the universe, my poems. I'll end with one poem which I wrote about our state now, because we are all in some sense lonely, even though we try to communicate in these virtual ways. So it's about loneliness. It's called Alone. Alone. I sit alone in my room and look out the window to make sure the world is still there. There stands a grown-up tamarind tree, a swing on one of its lower branches, and a boy on it swinging higher and higher. The tree stands firm, careful the boy doesn't fall. A calf and a cat watch the scene with raised tails. The boy's dad is reading a newspaper. It carries a girl's photo. The 2 children have similar faces, but the girl is dead. The life that has left her is on the branch of that tamarind tree. It is watching with excitement its living brother on the swing. I am alone in the room and looking out the window to make sure the world is still there. A horse is speeding outside. On it is a hunter who beautifies himself with young men's blood every day, like the sun. Earth trembles beneath its hooves. There is fresh blood on its mane, blood that moves on a swing. I sit alone in the room. The world sits alone outside. The bangled bough of a laburnum offers me a bouquet from the window. There is the life of a child on its crotch. That is my life. That bouquet falls on my body. A breeze gently moves it, as if it were a swing, as if I were a child sitting on it, on a tamarind tree, in my village compound, south of my house, north of death. Okay, I'll read just one, because I wrote quite a lot of poems about the migrant laborers, 3 or 4. I will read the last one I wrote about them, which is very short. It is called The Train, a train that is not carrying the laborer. It's called The Train. And I'll end with this, Paka. The Train. The train is going to my village, but I am not in it. Its rails are inside me. Its wheels are on my chest, and its whistle is my scream. I won't be there when it comes back to take me, but my life will travel, seated on its roof, guarding my corpse. As the train stops at my village, my life will enter my body and ride my waiting bicycle along the old familiar lanes. My children will come running as they hear its bell. Abbu is here, Abbu is here. In which language can I tell them it is my dead body that has arrived? Of the language of heaven or of hell? I am somewhere in between. Let the well talk or the pond. If water refuses to speak, let my life dwell within a crow on the drumstick tree on my courtyard and tell them the truth. Thank you.